Welcome back to the darker side of boxing, season 3, episode number 2. This is the good, the bad and the ugly, the story of Eamonn Magee. A really great story that we've both enjoyed researching ahead of this episode. Now, what you think you may know about Eamonn Magee, I think you're going to find some information out here that maybe you don't know, and if you do already know it, then it'll just be like rehashing the story once more, won't it? It'll be great. But for us personally, it was one that we felt needed to be included for the season because there's many things that happen inside and outside of the ring with Eamon that are significant in his life, in his history, in his background, in his origins, and in his boxing career inside of the ring as well. People might look at him and go, well, he didn't really do so much in his career, but, you know, actually I probably think maybe he achieved more than what people expected out of him. So, you know, this whole story, this whole tale gives you the good, the bad and the ugly, and it's a great story.
It is a great story, and the one thing with Eamonn Magee is I've discovered doing this research is that he was actually a better boxer. Absolutely, what you just said there, a better boxer than many people give him credit for. And he was a fantastic amateur. He could have gone on to do bigger and better things, to be honest, but the trouble in his life prevented that from happening. So, you know, we're going to go into some details that, you know, some of our Irish listeners, if you're listening in, we may misinterpret certain places, especially myself. So we do apologise from the off for that. We will do our best with making sure that everything is correct. But, you know, it's so difficult. In Northern Ireland, my family, my dad's side, they're all from Northern Ireland. They all live through this time. My aunties and my uncles. So forgive me. I mean, I should know more than I do. And this is a bit of an eye-opener for me because it makes me realise just what they live through during this terrible time.
Now, as always, we begin by setting some context to the story. And as Johnston's rightly pointed out there, we're actually going to take it a little bit away from Eamon and just sort of focus on the context of what was going on in and around the country. So we're going to begin this story with an event in the history of Northern Ireland that transformed the country. And it could be argued that the violence in this month of August continues to shape this country to its present day. And it was also the day that shaped the life of Eamonn Magee, who wasn't even born yet, but would be raised in Ardoyne, a working class and mainly Catholic and Irish Republican district in North Belfast, Northern Ireland. The majority of the Catholic community welcomed the British soldiers, famously serving them tea and toast in hope that they would protect them from the escalating violence. However, when the Troubles began, they found their loyalties misplaced. From August the 12th to the 16th, 1969, there was an outbreak of political and sectarian violence throughout Northern Ireland, which is often seen as the beginning of the 30-year conflict known as the Troubles. Some say the Troubles began on an autumn day in 1968 in Derry. Others predate it a couple of years to May 1966 and the re-emergence of the Ulster Volunteer Force, also known as the UVF, on the streets of Belfast. For many, the so-called Battle of the Bogside on August 12, 1969 was the day it all erupted in Derry, with 3 days of fierce clashes between the Royal Ulster Constabulary and thousands of Catholic nationalist residents of the Bogside district. It's important that we don't stray too far from our main character in this story, but it's also important for us to set the scene and put some context to the story of Eamonn Magee. On the night of August 16th, 1969, Ardoyne would become one of the areas where the escalating violence would fall upon. It began on the Crumlin Road in North Belfast, which marked the boundary between the Protestant loyalist Wood Vale district to the south and the Catholic nationalist Ardoyne district to the north.
Well, according to Scarman Tribunal, which was the official government investigation into the riots, around 10:30 p.m, a pitched battle erupted on Crumlin Road between members of the two communities. Now, the RUC, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, made baton charges into the Catholic streets using a Hummer armoured vehicle to smash through the barricades that were built. The Scarman Tribunal recorded that they were followed by a crowd of loyalists who reportedly threw petrol bombs at the Catholics over the heads of the RUC officers. The RUC were pelted with stones and petrol bombs from nationalists, and there were reports of nationalist gunfire coming from Herbert Street. Police responded by firing Sterling submachine gun at several houses on the street, killing Catholic civilian Samuel McLarnon, who was aged 27. As Samuel and his pregnant wife debated whether to risk running up the road to leave their two children, aged 2 and 1, with his mother, 3 RUC bullets came through the window. One entered Sammy's skull, while his eldest son looked on as he died on the living room floor. 27-year-old bus conductor was the Erdogan's first official victim of the Troubles. A police ombudsman report later concluded that this was disproportionate and posed a risk to civilian life. An hour later, on Butler Street, a Hummer vehicle was struck by petrol bombs, caught fire and stalled. As the RUC officers jumped out, they allegedly came under fire from the nationalist crowd. A head constable told his officers to fire a warning strike over the heads of the crowd, which they did with a Sterling submachine guns and revolvers. Now, when the shooting at police continued, he ordered his officers to fire for effect. So, in other words, shoot to wound or kill. Catholic civilian Michael Lynch, aged 28, was killed. Michael and a friend sheltered in a doorway on Butler Street, fearing for their lives.
They were playing no role in the riots, and their only wish was to make it home about 4 streets away. Finally, they made their move and ran, ducking across the road in the direction of Elmfield Street. A high-velocity bullet fired from close range pierced Michael's chest, and he was dead before his body hit the floor. 10 other people were wounded by gunfire in the area that night, all of them Catholics. On another night, the British Army were nowhere to be seen in Erdogan, so locals hijacked 50 buses, parked them at various entry points to the district, and set them ablaze. 20 people were injured by shotgun blasts. The Scarman report later noted that an RUC armoured vehicle sat by and watched as a loyalist mob set Brookfield Street alight, house by house. In response, Republican gunmen shot dead David Linton, an innocent man walking along the Crumlin Road and the first Protestant civilian to lose his life in the Troubles. So, where does Eamon Magee sit within all this mayhem? Well, his father, Terence, was one of the many young Erdogan men who felt compelled to do something more to defend his people. As his wife Isabel put it, her husband simply got more involved. Terence would become a high-ranking member of the Provisional Irish Republican Army, also known as the PIRA, or also known as the Provost. Paul Gibson, the author of The Lost Soul of Eamon Magee, explains the split best when he says, "The riots, along with the old guard IRA's apparent inability to protect their own community, accelerated a split in the militant Republican movement, which gave birth to the PIRA. Those who stayed put, the men and women who adhered to an ideology of revolutionary socialism rather than the romantic physical force nationalism of the Provost, became known as the official IRA, or the Stickies."
Well, even though Terence had aligned himself with the PIRA, he never told his wife or his family. The less they knew that he felt, the better. For the next 2 years and beyond, Eamon would be born into surroundings that were elegantly described. Once again, we're going to use Paul Gibson, who wrote, he was raised within the epicenter of Belfast sectarian violence in the Erdogan, a small Republican enclave of barely 5,000 people, surrounded on all sides by the loyalist strongholds on Crumlin Road, Glenbryn and the Torrens Estate. It is what is known in Belfast as the interface area. A drop of green in a perilous lake of red, white and blue, separated from geographical neighbourhoods by so-called peace walls, the barbed wire-topped barriers that scar the city. The isolation naturally fosters a siege mentality, a belief that it is them against the world and they must fight to survive. The frequently dark reality of life within North Belfast district during the Troubles proved that belief to be well placed more often than not. Now, Eamon Magee was officially born on July the 13th, 1971, when barricades separated the nationalists and unionist areas. They would soon be reinforced with British Army barbed wire and later replaced by, the irony of it, peace walls, which is incredible. It still makes me laugh that. It's insane to call them peace walls. That continued to divide society to this day. Full-scale riots erupted on a weekly basis, and a series of shootings, bombings were carried out by rival parliamentary factions that were quickly gaining a stronghold in working-class districts. It was nothing short of a war zone, with one high-ranking British officer commenting that when he first arrived in Belfast and toured the devastation, he felt like he had stepped into the Second World War battle scene photograph. 2 weeks after Eamon was born, the army shot 3 dead in Erdogan during Operation Demetrius. The British and Unionist governments decided to round up an eventual total of 2,000 Catholic males for interrogation.
The so-called 14 hooded men were identified and put under severe torture using the 5 techniques later to be ruled inhuman and degrading by the European Court of Human Rights. They were starvation, forced stress positions, sleep deprivation, sensory deprivation, and subjection to noise. The McGees, along with 7,000 Catholics across the city, were left homeless. After staying with the in-laws, the family were finally given a terraced house to live where they would stay for the next 10 years. Terence by this point was a full-blown alcoholic and was suffering with depression, which was being treated with antidepressants and electroshock procedures. In the meantime, he continued to work with the true successors to the original incarnation of the army, and in addition to being called the Provisional IRA or Provost, it was soon widely referred to in nationalist circles as the IRA or the army. While he felt he was defending his turf and family against the enemy, Isabel tried to give her children a better life in school and kept them fed. Terence was not a bad man. He was a man that fought for his family, a freedom fighter, not a terrorist, but was forced into the position he was now in. At this time, the people of Erdogan viewed the IRA as a legitimate military force and the only group with half a chance of protecting their vulnerable existence. They were a disciplined army, focused on defensive attacks against the members of the British state security personnel. What they would become was not the same organisation that Terence originally joined. Erdogan was a tiny district. Its perimeter was little more than a 1-mile walk all the way around. Everyone knew everyone, and death was a common theme. It must have been like living in a war zone or like living in the Wild West with terraced houses, streets and alleyways.
From October 1971 to December 1972, 20 Erdogan residents were murdered. With the intense troubles always around the corner, Terence would continue to be away from his family. His involvement meant that the McGee household would be constantly raided at unreasonable hours. The house would be ripped apart, belongings chucked around the house. The British soldiers, well, they would always be volatile, and they would even take pictures of Eamon and his 3 brothers, Terry, Noel, and Patrick. Isabel remembered their raids, and she said, "What were they doing? Why did foreign soldiers feel it necessary to wake up my children in the middle of the night, march them downstairs, line them up, and take photographs? Why did they do it over and over again?" It wasn't just the raids from British soldiers who came bursting in through the night. It would also be the IRA, who would use each other's houses for sniper points in the loft or to stash their rifles. Isabel, well, she wasn't happy about it. She always would threaten to grass them up to the authorities, so they would never lie around the house for too long. Terence was hardly ever around as the troubles peaked, staying most of his nights in a safe house. However, the one night he decided to stay home, the house was raided again. And once again, with Isabel, she remembered this. She said she remembered it well. She said, "There were no charges or trials. The soldiers just banged through the door one night, came up the stairs, dragged him out of bed, and that was that." He was interned in Longkesh. Eamon would have been about 3 years old. It left me with the 4 boys on my own, and bombings and shootings and riots every night outside the front door. It was a really bad time, very hard on all of us. I bet it was. Well, Terence was sent to Longkesh, as Isabel said, a prison used to house alleged parliamentary prisoners during the Troubles from August 1971 to September 2000.
The reason for his long stay was not for anything specific. Eamon said his old man was simply perceived as a threat to the British state, and that was all the justification that they needed. His exact words were, "The British Army picked up anyone in those days. Those were their orders from their Prime Minister, and they're still doing it to this day." There was no arrest, no trial and no sentencing. Terence was simply picked up and locked away like a prisoner of war. Isabel would take the half-an-hour bus trip to visit her husband twice a week, and even though Eamon was only 3 years old, some of the wives wouldn't travel to see their husbands if they knew he was on the bus. It was suggested that his reputation was already beginning, and the author Paul Gibson wrote, "He'd be in and out of handbags, clambering over everyone, pushing and pulling at whoever got in his way, and kids twice his age were already wary of his small swinging fists." Eamon says that the couple of heart-rendering visits he made as a small child to visit his father, universally known as Doc, are burned into my memory. As the years rolled on, Eamon remembered, "We were always smuggling something in, even just for the crack. I'd have done it just for the buzz. That would be anything, from fruit to tiny letters, written in minuscule hand on both sides of a cigarette paper, folded up, encased in cling film and hidden under his tongue." The conditions that Terence was subjected to were nothing short of atrocious, to say the least. It was quite literally torture. By the time Eamon was old enough, he did well at school when he applied himself, but what he was more interested in was danger. His oldest brothers, Terry and Noel, stayed away from the dangers and began boxing at the Sacred Heart Primary School Amateur Club.
Well, they were later joined by their younger brother Patrick, and Isabel was trying to keep Eamon off the streets. I mean, he's a little nipper, a little tearaway already. So she's trying to keep him off the streets too. So when all three attended the boxing club, she wanted Eamon to join them, even though he was still only 5 years old. It kept him busy for a while, but it wouldn't make much difference yet anyway. Isabel understood the importance of the discipline of boxing and what it could give to her 4 sons, especially after her father was also a boxer who excelled in a noble art. She made sure all 4 boys attended the boxing club 3 times a week, even though the short walk could be very dangerous for them. Having to duck and dive out of the way of petrol bombs and rubber bullets as they travelled to and from the gym was a common theme. And Eamon remembered that with his mum, this is him, forcing his mum, sort of forcing him to go. You had to go Monday, Wednesday, Friday. It was like school. You were never allowed a night off. If you wanted one, you had to hike off. I think my mother was looking for a break for a couple of hours at night. All 4 would go to have successful careers. Now, Patrick was one of the best juniors in Northern Ireland at lightweight. Terry fought on into his late 20s and recorded 21 victories as a professional, including claiming the Irish super welterweight crown and losing a fight for the European equivalent. Noel was even more successful. As an 18-year-old, he twice beat the great Steve Collins at senior level, picking up the Irish light heavyweight title. As a professional, he mixed it with 2 world champions, which is Fabrice Tiozzo and Darius Michael Wesky, who fought for the British and the European titles, won a Commonwealth belt, and at his peak was actually ranked as high as number 7 in the world by the WBC. But that being said, it was Eamon Magee, who was the natural.
His first and only amateur trainer, Patsy McKenna, saw the potential as soon as he saw him. By the time he was 7, he could throw every combination in the book. The senior coach, Eamonn Magee, told Patsy, "That youngest McGee lad has something about him. He's going to be very special." His southpaw stance, counter-punching and slick controlled movement demonstrated his potential. Even though he fought just 1 round as a very young amateur, Eamon won his first 10 fights, with many coming by stoppage, which also showcased his power. He lost his 11th by a dubious decision, but was becoming the talk of the country and became a regular in the boxing halls of the North and West Belfast. No records are kept until a boxer is 11 years old, but Eamon guesses he had between 80 and 100 fights in 4 years, and the defeats could be counted on one hand. Even though he thrived in boxing, the outside dangers always attracted Eamon. He was always wanting to get close to the action that was never far from his home or boxing gym, and Eamon recalls, As kids, we didn't realise what it all meant, so it was exciting for us. There were hard times, hard days, but good crack. If you got clipped, you had to fight back. I'm not talking about outsiders, I'm talking about fighting our own, street corner against street corner. The only place we had to go was the corners. Patsy once remembered what he told Eamon one night. "You see that woman over there?" while motioning to Isabel. And Eamon responded, "Aye, me ma." Patsy said, "That's not your mother." Puzzled, Eamon asked, "What do you mean that's my ma?" Patsy said, "It's not. It can't be. You were adopted. You were a stray. She picked you up from the care home."
Confused, Eamon responded, "No, she didn't." Patsy was being sarcastic, obviously, and he told him that she must have. Why else would her other three sons be going straight back to their houses after training every night while you're on the street in your gang, building your own wee barricades, running wild and looking for trouble? Eamon wasn't interested in no prep talk, and he told Patsy quite simply to fuck off under no uncertain terms. Eamon wouldn't listen to anyone who advised him not to get involved in the trouble. He joined a local gang, as Patsy mentioned there, around the age of 6 years old, passing the initiation to enter, which included avoiding those rubber bullets being fired by British soldiers. He got a tattoo with E and M on his forearm and a piercing of one of his mates with a hot needle. Now, we're guessing this would have been when he was a bit older than 6, but this is Eamonn Magee, one of the hardest bastards around, so we wouldn't be surprised if he was 6-year-old getting tattoos and piercings. Who knows? He also loved a thing called hopping cars, which involved using a sledge. So while he's sitting on a sledge, he would grab hold of a car bumper and let the car pull him along. When his mum found out, she took him to the local priest for a dressing down, obviously while Terence is still inside. Eamon explained to the priest what he was doing. He said, "I was hopping cars, father. You wait till one's going at the right speed, then you grab the back and slide along behind it down the street." His advice to stop acting up fell on deaf ears once again. When his father was finally released from practically a prison camp in 1975, he emerged half the man that he was when he went in. Suffering even more so with depression, he hit the bottle and self-medicated with sleeping pills. He tried to keep his illness from his family, but it was pretty clear to see he was really struggling.
One afternoon in 1977, a patrol of British soldiers burst into the Magee household. Eamon seized his opportunity and jumped into the empty Saracen, an armoured vehicle with a machine gun on top, and stood up, holding the gun. Well, his mates pissed themselves with laughter, but then a soldier arrived and dragged 6-year-old Eamon out of the vehicle. His friends began to kick their footballs at the soldier and Saracen, at which point Terence arrived and demanded the soldier give the ball back. More soldiers arrived back at the Saracen, and Terence took a beating on the footpath. Not done with him, they dragged him back inside his own home and gave him a further beating on his living room floor while his wife watched on. The 4 brothers stood at the front door, filled with rage and anger, but unable to intervene. Not long after the incident, Terence was removed from the family home yet again, this time for a bounce check, and not the British soldiers, but by the internal IRA Crime Stoppers. They were an administrative branch that upheld their own law because the RUC would not venture into certain territories to do it themselves. He was shipped out of the country to England and didn't return for 2.5 years. Eventually, a high-level IRA officer told Isabel he would return if she wanted him. She did, and once again he was back with the family. However, he disappeared in the attic of the house, scared for his life, for around 18 months. He had fallen into a severe depression and continued to drink, which obviously affected the family greatly. So it was to no surprise when Eamon took to the bottle. His mother thought it started when he was 12, but Eamon admitted that it started when he was 9.
The apple don't fall too far, does it, as they say. After nicking a bottle of cider, he took himself up to the household attic where his father had spent almost 2 years of his life, and he drank himself numb. The dangers on the streets were never far away. As we keep saying, one night Eamon and his friend were walking home from a youth club when a car slowed to almost stop, but then drove on. The car continued, and they witnessed the window roll down and a man not far in front of them get gunned down. It was a random attack on a Catholic man. If the boys were a few years older, it would have been them. 3 of the 4 brothers would eventually leave the family home. Terry was the first to leave, staying in Wales after visiting for a boxing tournament. And Eamon found it difficult to forgive him at first. The young and naive youngest felt like Terry had abandoned them. In 1981, a Republican prisoner by the name of Bobby Sands died of starvation in prison after refusing to eat. Now, this story has been told through a movie called Hunger. If you haven't seen it, go and have a look at it. This act actually boosted the IRA recruitment and increased popular support for the parliamentaries in the nationalist community. If the political tension couldn't have got any more heightened, it did. The result was the death of a teenage boy, Danny Barrett, who was just sitting on his wall outside his house with his friends. The boys heard gunshots and ran into the Barrett household. Once the sound of gunshots stopped, they returned to the wall on a summer's evening. Shots rang out once again. Most of the boys ducked behind the wall, but Danny remained seated, not allowing the shots to ruin his evening. Seconds later, he dropped to the floor. His father was unaware that he had been shot until a pool of blood began to emerge around him. Danny had been shot in the neck and was dying.
An ambulance got to the house quickly and got him stable, but a mobile RCU patrol and 2 army checkpoints prevented the ambulance getting to the hospital on time, and he died en route. To make the whole situation even worse, while family and friends gathered in a state of shock, the Brits raided the Barrett home and the houses of Danny's friends. They found nothing. At a later inquest, an unnamed soldier insisted Danny had been firing a rifle. This was an unfounded and false allegation that forensic test soon dismissed out of hand. Danny's anonymous killer was never prosecuted. You're probably wondering why we're actually telling you this story. Well, it was these sorts of incidents that put the fire in a young Eamonn Magee's belly. Moments like this must have enraged him and his brothers and many people around him, with the likes of Margaret Thatcher declaring, "Mr. Sands was a convicted criminal. He chose to take his own life." Then, the British soldiers covering up the murder of a teenage boy, which did not get the same press coverage, nor did the Prime Minister have any words on his murder. Eamon heard the news of Danny Barrett when walking home from the gym with his 2 older brothers. His oldest brother, Terry, was gone and never coming back. His dad was still there physically, but he was gone mentally. There was no one to help Eamon, who was now the perfect target for anyone who wanted to take advantage and use his rage and anger towards the British. Eamon remembered, "I remember when I was like 10 or 11 and we had the hunger strike. It was just a bad old fucking routine. And like anybody else, you had to get stuck in or get killed. Get stuck in or get beat." In 1982, 11-year-old Eamon moved from Holy Cross Primary School to St Gabriel's Secondary School on the Crumlin Road.
Well, his boxing skills had actually helped him build a reputation as a bully alleviator. So he was keen to earn that same respect in his new school. Now, the day came only 3 days into his new school, into his new secondary school, when he beat the shit out of a boy who was much older, much bigger, and much taller. And respect was automatically earned very early. But his card was also marked by the teachers, with one in particular, Vice Principal McGarland, who had it in for him, for Eamon, from literally the point that he started, from the point of having this fight. And Eamon gave his assessment on the vice principal, calling him, quite simply, a hateful cunt. Eamon got his own back after McGarland forced him and his classmates to wait outside in sub-zero conditions for their dinner by throwing an icy snowball in the back of his head. Eamon and his friend John Connolly devised a ridiculous plan to get themselves out of school for a few days, and that was to break each other's arms. Now, John went first, placing his arm on the curb so Eamon could jump on it. But the sound of that nasty break was enough for him to have second thoughts, and he correctly bottled it. He actually confessed the whole thing to his mum and what he was going to do, what he was planning to do, and why. And basically, she sent him back to school the next day, whereas obviously his mate had a few days off. But this is just another example of the certain dangers and levels of danger that he would put himself and his friends into willingly as well, in so early in his life. It's incredible, really. Now, while boxing was the one place he excelled, becoming the Antrim champion, Ulster champion, and then the Irish champion. He didn't lose a fight for years and successfully defended those 3 titles right the way through to senior level. The first All-Ireland win in 1983 was the one that left those close to him in no doubt that Eamonn Magee had the potential to go all the way to the very top, or the top of the amateur game anyway. He impressed further when the Americans sent out a very strong team to take on Ireland.
One of the most talented Americans was in Eamon's weight class, but he outclassed him comprehensively, taking a points decision. McGee was a slick counter-puncher with a sixth sense on judging the distance and avoiding punches. Around this time, Eamon and Wayne McCulloch became good friends while on the boxing circuit. When asked by Paul Gibson of their unlikely friendship, considering their geographic and political upbringings, he made his point clear. Listen, no one can help where they're born, right? I'm from the Airdown, I'm Irish, and I make no apologies for that. I was involved on the street as a kid, fighting the Brits, but that was just the way it was. That was nothing exceptional. All the boys I hung about with did the same. We'd sit around at night under the sniper towers in Flack Street Mill, listening to rebel tunes, brainwashing ourselves, really. Then when the riot started, we'd join in. And yes, we called the Brits our enemy, but I don't hate any group of people, and I certainly never hated Protestants in Northern Ireland. I didn't give a fuck that Wayne was a Protestant from the Shankill. He was, and is, a beautiful man, impossible not to like. It's as simple as that. Now in his teens, Eamon had moved on from throwing insults at the British soldiers by the barricades to launching stones and paint bombs. Isabel would try her best to stop him, even walking into the middle of a riot and pulling him out. His hatred was further heightened when Eamon and all his boxing buddies were forced to their knees while their minibus and belongings were ransacked by soldiers at another checkpoint on their way back from a boxing tournament in Dublin. Eamon was not known yet to the British soldiers, but he was now associated with a gang of older teenagers that were becoming their future enemies.
He was also known to the Republicans as Terence's tearaway son. And once again, Paul Gibson, who was a great source for this whole story, do go and read his book, wrote what happened to young Eamon around this time. He said, one morning he was dressed for school, 3 men knocked on the door, walked him several streets away, and blindfolded and spun their captive to disorientate him before depositing him in a supposedly unknown house. There he was laid on the floor of a back room, his arms spread wide as if in crucifixion, with heavy men kneeling on his back, forcing him to maintain the stress position until his muscles trembled in agony. They wanted names and information on neighbourhood vandals, drug peddlers and joyriders, but Eamon wouldn't open his mouth. He knew who it was and where he had been taken, but he was eventually released and sent on his way. I mean, this is this ain't even a teenage boy. It's incredible. Eamon never said a word to anyone until one night, 30 years on, he approached the man who was then in his 60s and demanded, do you remember what you did to me that morning? I was just a kid getting ready for school, just like your own kids were getting ready for school that morning, and you dragged me out of my mother's house and tortured me. The man basically shit his pants and tried to duck out of the way while others tried to calm Eamon down. He shouted to the man, for what? For what? Oh, you can't. That stuck with him for 30 years. I mean, that stuck with anyone for 30 years. There's more shit that happens to Eamon, but still. But funny thing was, I think it was a technique to just suss him out and see if he would talk, because he was being monitored. He was monitored for another year, and then finally approached with an invitation to join the IRA's youth wing. And without hesitation, funny enough, he accepted. After all, he hated the Brits for what they had done, and he wanted them out of Ireland. And within days, he was sworn in and out on active service, literally from day one. His first job was to make sure that the petrol drums were full, and then he moved on to robbing the milkman for his empty bottles. And together they, of course, created an endless pot of petrol bombs that could be used against their enemies.
He also nicked cars, buses and vans that could be used for barricades. Eamon was picked up by the RUC and taken to Castlereagh Detention Centre in the mid-80s. This was a horrific place that the RUC would use to beat and torture confessions out of hundreds of people, many of them entirely innocent. Cigarettes were stubbed out on the faces, lighters were held to the testicles, legs were stamped on until bone fractured, severe beatings were administered, mock strangulations were carried out, and even reports of waterboarding have emerged years after the events. Terrible, terrible place. Eamon had his dad with him during his interrogation, which was just verbal until Eamon was stopped and forced to watch someone else being interrogated. He saw a man's head getting kicked in as blood spattered on the white walls. Eamon's interrogator looked at him and said, "Men are paid to make boys like you talk, you know." Eamon and his dad moved on to the final interrogation room, but he never buckled. Instead, when they let him go, he was back on the streets hijacking vehicles for barricades, refuelling petrol drums, collecting empty milk bottles, and then chucking them at the British soldiers. In 1987, Eamon was getting ready to compete for Ireland in the Gaelic Games and was in fine condition. On the way back from the gym, he could hear a riot in full swing. He stashed his gym bag, grabbed a bottle of gasoline, and was trying to light the cloth when an IUC Hummer pig turned the corner towards him. They spotted Eamon struggling with his lighter and took aim. The 3-inch plastic bullet whizzed past the tip of his nose and struck him square on the right side of his chest, and he reeled back, but he didn't fall. By the time the shock had subsided and the pain had taken over, he found himself in a safe house being attended to by the local IRA nurse.
Thanks to being in such good condition, the bullet didn't actually penetrate through his torso, but it was decades before that shadowy bruise totally disappeared. Eamon said, "That bastard shot to kill that night. He tried to murder me." Eamon was now obviously turning his attentions to the IRA when not competing in the ring. And like his mates on the street corners, Eamon was captivated by the Troubles, and he said that they had a need to defend our area. The whole area was involved. That's the way it was in those days. The Erdon has always been on its own, a little part of Belfast on its own, a stronghold. They couldn't take it over. When you were living in there, you didn't realise that there's another world outside. You know what I mean. Everyone knows your business, and you can't say anything without getting back. It probably will never change. Now, meanwhile, his dad had continued to intensify his drinking habits to mask his depression. However, he was now returning home as pissed as a fart, and he actually began to turn violent towards Isabel. She had supported her husband through the darkest of times, and she left him sometime in the mid-1980s. Eamon was now the only one left in the family, so he was most affected by their split. He left school as early as possible and began working with his dad in the construction business. Due to his fine start in boxing, Terence actually gave his son a nickname, Rocky 2, of course referring to the Rocky films. They worked hard, and they worked bloody hard day and night, but they also drank very hard together. And Terence was more aware of his son's involvement in the IRA, although he had been kicked to the curb, and he was sort of not involved in it anymore. He still had people he could go to. So he was still an influence, often helping his now 17-year-old son out when he basically fell into some very difficult situations. And there will be many.
Eamon was becoming a man, but he was bright enough and not brainwashed enough to recognise that a life in the IRA was only going to end badly. He would either end up dead like many of his Conrad friends, in prison like his dad, or having to live with the unforgiving things the IRA were beginning to do and what they would go on to do. He had a choice, and his choice was to get out, but there were always tragic events that kept pulling him back, like the day before St. Patrick's Day in 1988, when his dad went to the Milltown Cemetery to pay his respects to 3 provisional IRA members killed in Gibraltar by an Ulster Defence Association member. Michael Stone attacked the mourners with hand grenades and pistols. As Stone then ran towards the nearby motorway, a large crowd chased him and he continued shooting and throwing grenades. Some of the crowd caught Stone and beat him, but he was rescued by the RUC and arrested. 3 people had been killed and more than 60 had been wounded. The unprecedented one-man attack was filmed by television news crews and caused shock around the world. Eamon watched it unfold on television, knowing his dad was there, but later found out his dad was unharmed. He'd legged it to the barricades to join in with the riots. Isabel was home when a neighbour told her that Eamon had been arrested. She ran into the riot to find her son, but he's nowhere to be seen. So she went home and prayed, then saw Eamon making his way home. She ran out in near hysterics, grabbed her son and struck him violently, screaming at the top of her voice, "Do you want to get shot? Is that what you want? Give me a gun and I'll shoot you right now if that's what you want."
Oh, it's probably easier. I mean, I can understand where she's coming from. Why just shoot him in the head now? At least I have to worry. And God, I mean, she must have been so worried for her son. And well, asked if there's one single moment that may have changed his idea of fighting on the Republican cause. Eamon said, "See the lights of Bootsy Begley, the Shankill Road bomber." Now, Begley was killed when a bomb he was planted on Shankill Road actually exploded prematurely, killing him, a UDA member, and 9 Protestant civilians. Well, Eamon continued with his story about Bootsy Begley, and he said, "We were the same age and knocked about with each other all our lives. We were in the Fianna together, we drank together, and yet I had no idea he was in the IRA, or the RA as he used to call it. As many called it. It says IRA or RA. So if you do it here, RA, that's what they're related to, obviously." And he carried on. He said, "I hadn't a fucking clue. Neither him nor Sean Kelly, who I see every day working in the shop round the corner. That could very easily have been me, you know. Wee things like that. It's hard to stop thinking about them. And wee Bootsy was a total gentleman. I know what he did was totally wrong and absolutely disgusting, but he was always a gentleman." It just shows you how it could have been him. When he shook his head in disbelief, and he said, "I wonder how Sean Kelly can live with that." I believe Sean was with him. So loyalists retaliated to that bomb in the fish and chip shop on Shankill Road by murdering 14 civilians in a week, 8 at once, when an UDA gunman yelled trick or treat before opening fire on a Halloween party in Grey Steel with an AK-47. Sounds like mobsters, doesn't it? I mean, it's incredible. There probably wasn't a single moment that made Eamon decide not to continue fighting for the cause, but more than likely a combination of significant moments, plus spending more time concentrating on his boxing. Patsy probably was the most positive and impressionable influence on Eamon's life that managed to keep him away from fighting for this cause. Little moments like when Eamonn Magee knocked out his opponent so bad that the guy's leg began twitching. He felt so bad that he told Patsy, "I didn't mean to do it."
Now, in between fights, Patsy and Eamon were having lunch when they saw the lad sitting on his own. Patsy suggested, "Go and offer him a sandwich and a drop of tea." Eamon approached his beaten opponent and offered him a chicken sandwich. Although tentative at first, they both relaxed and had a good chat, never once mentioning what happened. Eamon was then called in to compete in the final, and his new mate gave him an encouraging "good luck in the final" vote of confidence. Patsy was showing Eamon the importance of humanity and planting the seeds of having a conscience for your actions, beyond the boxing ring, and implanting it into his life skills. At this point, Eamon was the best welterweight in the country, but yet he was considered as the troublemaker within camp. He was always pranking around, which in turn meant that he would be the first to be accused of anything bad. Like when he was accused of nicking beer in Scotland, even though he was fighting in the ring at the time of the theft. Patsy was never concerned, as long as he applied himself, but the one thing that he detested was the drinking. One day he turned up pissed as a fart to compete for the Ulster title. After the first round, which Eamon won, Patsy complained, "I can smell the fucking drink off you from here, for fuck's sake." Eamon denied it and went on to win the title, even though he had downed 6 pints in the morning to cure an almighty hangover from the night before. No matter what Patsy said to Eamon about the importance of leaving the drink alone if he wanted to be a success, well, it just fell on deaf ears.
I can't help. I could fucking smell it on you, for fuck's sake. It just makes me laugh. He downed 6 beers after having an almighty hangover. It's not funny, but it's just, I mean, you just can't make it up, can you? Well, the other problem with Eamon Magee was his street fighting. The Magee brothers were always challenged to a street fight because of who they were. They were known for their boxing potential. As boxing potentials, obviously people wanted to take them on. Eamon was the most targeted because of his level of success in the country. And he recalled, "I never went looking for it. Trouble just always seemed to find me." Whether it was a guy with a belly full of beer who took a chance on Eamon when he was on crutches one time, only to get obviously rendered on the pavement, or a couple of bully boys who jumped him and his mate Budgie with baseball bats, yet still end up on the cobbles. Eamon was never far from trouble. It was those street fights that always slowed down his progress in boxing, and Patsy recalled he missed the multinationals tournament in Italy in 1988 with 2 broken knuckles after dealing with some guy behind the shamrock. Trouble was never far away from young Eamon, but more tragedy struck when his young uncle Nipper, aged 33, died. Now, after Nipper and Eamonn Magee enjoyed a skinful until closing time, they went home pissed in good spirits, said goodbye to each other. However, Nipper, he fell asleep on his sofa and never woke up. And Eamon, well, he was devastated by it. And he was also the last person to see him alive. In 1989, Eamon finally got the chance to compete in the Gaelic Games in Canada, along with his pal Wayne McCulloch. Unable to restrain himself from pissing around, he brought an older woman back to the hotel, and let's just say he enjoyed himself immensely while his teammates were locked outside the room. The next day, Eamon won a gold medal and picked up the Boxer of the Tournament award after a series of impressive victories. What made his performance even more impressive was the fact that he had to scratch his bollocks throughout the whole tournament after catching crabs from the older woman the night before.
Oh dear. Now there you go. There is a story that is just Eamon Magee all over, isn't it? Not the
Brilliant.
fact that he likes going around catching crabs, of course, but the fact that he was just, doing what he was doing. I thought it was brilliant. A brilliant story from Eamon Magee there. And Eamon, obviously, if you're listening to this episode, you are some man. You are really some man. Now, in August, the Irish Amateur Boxing Association, also known as IABA, sent him to Puerto Rico to fight against the world's elite in the World Junior Championships. He was brilliant, beating excellent fighters from Bulgaria, Cuba and Puerto Rico, but lost in the final to a German. However, he took home an impressive silver medal. The headline in a Belfast Telegraph read, Eamon High, who described Magee as a rarity in the sport, in that he can box or fight depending on what is required, and a clever boxer with a punch that comes naturally to him. Afterwards, Irish professional boxing promoter Barney Eastwood tried to tempt him into turning pro, but Magee was still focused on the 1990 Commonwealth Games in Auckland, New Zealand. Eamon recalled, I always wanted to go to the Commonwealth Games, and I knew that if I came home from Puerto Rico with a medal, I would be in line for a trial. However, that dream was dashed by a vote in the Ulster Boxing Council that rejected the idea of Magee fighting a trial against Eddie Fisher to see who deserved the spot on the plane to New Zealand. While dealing with that disappointment a week later, he was stabbed in the neck with a broken bottle, leaving a gaping hole in his neck. Eamon collapsed to the pavement, but the stranger was not done. He swung a metal pole at the wounded Eamon, but he managed to avoid the swipe and get his hand on the weapon. After a brief struggle, he wrenched it free and went on the offensive himself. Despite the hurt he had inflicted when he slashed the sharp end of the fractured glass bottle against Magee's throat, the attacker knew better than to continue the fight now that Eamon was armed. He immediately spun and fled into the night.
Well, by some miracle, there was an ambulance waiting at a nearby traffic lights, and it sped him to Mater Hospital and straight into the operating theatre. Dozens of stitches were required both inside and out of the wound, but surgeons assured him he was a very, very lucky boy. The glass that was actually thrust into the flesh missed external jugular vein by millimeters. If it had been severed, he'd have died. The attack was a retaliation from Eamon and his gang when they had dished out a beating to a rival gang from New Lodge. A week later, the attacker was actually given a severe kicking that culminated in several layers of his skin from the man's face being left on a pebble-dashed wall. After the violence and retaliations, these two incidents luckily ended their feud before someone was killed, quite simply. I'm surprised neither did. Eamon admits that still to this day, the man that tried to kill him, he sees him on a monthly basis, but the historic encounter never escalated further. They even nod to each other to greet as they passed by one another. I mean, incredible. Incredibly, Eamon was back on the street in 6 weeks later, becoming the Irish Intermediate Champion. He then won fights in Rome. We saw Pope John Paul II. In 1990, he met Mary Grogan. They moved in together, and not long after, they were expecting their first child, Francis. So in 1990, Eamon competed in his first full year as a senior, losing in both the Irish and Ulster Championships, ironically to Eddie Fisher, an opponent that got the better of him a third time also in 1991. But obviously Patsy and McGee, well, they felt they deserved at least the nod on at least two of those occasions. So they felt it should have been 2-1 McGee. He won and lost in a tour of America and lost by 1 point to Rob McCracken in the 1990 World Cup.
That's the same Rob McCracken who trained Anthony Joshua and Carl Froch, for anybody that didn't know who Rob McCracken was. Now, Patsy wanted Eamon to drop down to the light welterweight division, but for that to happen, he needed to drink and eat less and run a bit more, which Eamon did. Success was instant. He won his first Ulster Senior Championships in 1992 and had an eye on the Olympics in Barcelona. When Sugar Shane Mosley arrived in Ireland, McGee stepped in for Fisher to face the best light welterweight in the world. It was a closely fought contest that Mosley won 25-17, but Eamon felt that he deserved the nod, and he said he was good, very good. Fast hands, strong, just a very good fighter, but I still reckon I beat him that day. He now had to win the Nationals to have a chance at making the Olympics, and he won all 3 fights, demonstrating excellent counter-punching, distance control and ring management. 2 weeks after being crowned the best light welterweight in Ireland, at just 20 years old, his second child, Eamonn Magee, was born. With his life on the verge of change, Eamonn Magee should have been an automatic pick for the Olympics in Barcelona. But once again, a number of members from the Ulster Boxing Council abstained from voting for his nomination, and this led to the Irish selection team requesting that Magee fight a preliminary fight against Billy Walsh, a boxer whom he had already beaten to win the Irish title. In protest, Eamon turned down the chance to box off for his place on the plane because he felt he was the automatic choice. Eamon told the press, "I'm sick of the way we are treated as amateur boxers. It's time everyone knew why these trials were called for. They're nothing but a political move by Dublin after 7 out of 12 national titles ended up in the north. Frankly, I'm disgusted. If they want this Olympic place for go, let them have it."
Well, Eamon looked back with anger on his decision. Absolutely, you would. I have some anger towards certain members of the Ulster Council who refused to back me, he said. They abstained from voting and stopped me from fighting for Ireland in the Olympics. And on that night, Eamon was due to fight in the box-off. He stayed with friends getting pissed and never got the opportunity to represent Ireland in Barcelona. It was Gough that went ahead of him. And Eamon was offered the chance to actually fight in the secondary team, which flew out to the Canary Islands. Now, many thought he wouldn't show up, but he did. However, he had different intentions. His intentions were to use this trip as an all-paid jolly-up with no interest in boxing whatsoever. When someone stupidly allowed him into the ring one night, a pissed-up Eamon Magee sank his teeth into an unsuspecting Spaniard's neck and was disqualified as the poor man squealed in terror. Not bothered at all, he ended up at the bar, still in his boxing gear as well, apparently. I wonder if he still has boxing gloves on. Burying his head in the sand. And ironically, it was one of his boxing team that actually handed him his first ecstasy pill, and he loved it. So much so that when he arrived home, he took his new habit with ease, and it went hand in hand with his job as a bouncer working on the door of a nightclub. Not only did he take ecstasy, he also began selling it. And the IRA hated their drug dealers. And they also hated the Irish People's Liberation Organisation, also known as IPLO. Now, this was a small Republican parliamentary group which was more involved in drugs, prostitution, and racketeering. Now, the IRA decided one night to come down on this group hard. And within one night, they pretty much ended the organisation by executing the second in command and kneecapping a dozen associates by gunpoint. Now, although Eamon Magee was not associated with this party whatsoever, he was on the list because of his drug dealing exploit. So Eamon was on this list and the IRA were coming for him.
In hope that they would let him go, he went to see his dad, aka Doc, for help, but unfortunately it was too late. A shot to the leg would be the punishment. The order was that if Eamon was ready at the time of them knocking one night, they would show leniency by shooting the flesh of his leg rather than go through the bone. On the night, an IRA representative was due at 6 p.m. Eamon answered the door and was taken down an alley by a local organising committee member. A second masked man arrived, and with no warning, the shooter placed the muzzle of the gun to Eamon's trouser leg and fired a bullet through his left calf. The two provos then walked away without another word spoken. His dad arrived and added pressure to his son's wound before two of his brothers arrived to drive him to the hospital. Many men were in the same hospital being treated with gunshot wounds to the leg. It was a way of the IRA pointing out all the drug dealers to shame them. Eamon would continue to use drugs, but his leg wound was a reminder to him not to sell it anymore. It was also a reminder that his dad had saved his boxing career, and with that inspiration, he returned to the ring 6 months later. His return was a chance to retain his Ulster Senior title, and unbelievably, Eamonn Magee was at his brilliant best, despite his leg wound reopening in the final. He took the title once again. His good form continued in Denmark, USA and Finland, but then his outside the ring exploits emerged in New York when he was caught pissing up the New York mayor's motor along with some of his teammates.
Just the sense of the high level IRA man shooting the back of your leg to then just pissing up the New York mayor's motor during a visit to New York is the craziness of the highs and the lows. I mean, it's still a low pissing on the mayor's motor, but it's really funny. Well, while in America, they also beat up an American citizen as well after he beeped his car horn too many times in a drive-through McDonald's. They're really excited about going to a drive-through McDonald's, by the way. They'd never been to one. This is the time when there was none. New York had it, and this guy kept bibbing. So, yeah, they give him a bit of hiding. He also met Muhammad Ali at the airport on his way home. He actually did some shadow boxing with the legend and actually got an autograph as well, which he still keeps apparently today. But his trouble outside the ring just didn't stop. Eamon ironed out a pissed up Russian heavyweight in Finland after he kicked off at his, as in Eamonn Magee's, hotel party room. In April 1993, his son Eamonn Magee Jr. was born. By August, he was being sentenced to 3 months in prison, suspended for 2 years following a conviction of common assault after badly beating up an old primary school classmate, in which Eamon regarded it as a fair fight between two men settling their differences. In November, he was pulled over by police for speeding erratically down the Crumlin Road. High as a kite, he refused to provide the arresting officers with a specimen, and so resisting arrest was added to the charges. He already had a long list of driving offences on his record, including driving with no licence, no insurance, no lights, obstructing the police, and providing false name and address. A load of fines and disqualifications was the judge's verdict, but it was these traffic violations that first put Eamon inside the high security Crumlin Road known as Exile, or locally known as the Crumb. He was incarcerated for only a short time, but even when he did get out, he was more interested in partying, getting smashed on the drink and drugs, and sleeping around with other women. Not only was his relationship with his wife suffering, but his performances in the ring began to fall way short, and he lost fights that he should have won easily. His attitude was so bad by this point that even his trusted coach and mentor, Patsy, decided he had had enough and he left.
Boxing was now done for Eamon. Drink and drugs were his new best friend, and nothing else came close. Now under its control, he began to use all sorts of different scams to earn money or get free drugs. One of his favourite scams was to march up to an unsuspecting punter in a bar or club, quickly flash a fake police badge, declare himself an undercover drug squad officer, and invite the target outside to be searched. Eamon's trained eye for spotting a dealer generally ensured a small bag of pills ended up in his possession 9 times out of 10. One time a victim panicked and ran, hurling 2 bags from his personal stash as he fled. McGee scooped them up and let him go. That catch netted him over 300 ecstasy tablets and guaranteed one hell of a weekend. He even sold headache tablets for 20 quid when at a rave. The IRA, well, they found out about it and pulled him up, but he managed to talk his way out of it, saying he was just teaching the teenagers a lesson. He would use many different and inventive ways of pinching the money out of fruit machines. Although they were petty crimes, Eamon took a step too far and stole a whole new kitchen from a house that was being revamped. That was the straw that broke the camel's back as far as the IRA were concerned, and they told him to leave the district. Just like his father years before, Eamon found himself locked up in a house for 9 months and dared not show his face. Then after a while, he felt that enough time had passed, so he began to show his face in the pubs and clubs again. And my word, all them different scams that he was doing while he was out of the boxing ring. I mean, fruit machines, fake police badges. I mean, these are just like, it's bad because there was a lot of people like getting fleeced, weren't they? But I'm laughing and you're laughing because it's just, you can't believe the audacity of it. But then again, you can because of where he was at in his life at this point.
Yeah, and I mean, even the pills as well. There is a little bit more to that story where he was, I believe it was like paracetamol or aspirin or something, and they had like a little letter on him. So he would suck each one so the letter would disappear as well, just to make it look even more real. It wasn't brilliant, but like you say, it's funny. I mean, you just read the book and you'll hear some of the ways he managed to pull some money out of the fruit machines as well. Some people may even try it. He had some great ways of doing it. So yeah, he's come out of his hole basically. He's not sure if he was clear or not. He's sort of he's sort of out and about in all the clubs, and he felt a tap on his shoulder one night at a bar. He turned to find himself face to face with the man who walked him from his mother's house down that alley a couple of years before, shot him in the leg. The man was now an OC from the district, and he asked, "What the fuck are you doing here?" Eamon basically nearly shit himself and began stuttering a response when the provo burst out laughing, slapped him on the back and said, "Don't worry me, wee man. I think you're all right to be back now." Well, that would soon change when Eamon and a mate beat up a connected RA man. Now, while he was working on the door of a club, a group of 10 to 12 RA men, tooled up with baseball bats and metal bars, took over Eamon's family home, telling Mary to stay in the front room with the kids while they searched for him. Mary kept telling him that he wasn't here and he wouldn't be coming home anytime soon, but in actual fact, she was expecting him to arrive home around midnight or just after. She managed to write on a bit of toilet roll with her eyeliner, and it said, "RA in-house, run like fuck," and she hung it outside the kitchen window. Now, when Eamon arrived home in his taxi and saw the message, he got out of there as quick as anything, back in the taxi, and he was gone. Now, by the early hours of the morning, they decided to give up the hunt, and Mary told the lead fella out of the group, "I told you were wasting your time," in which the man responded, "He's a lucky man. He wouldn't have walked again had we got him tonight." Eamon stayed away from the family home and the area for a while in fear of their return. Plus, his relationship with Mary was also on the rocks.
While away from Mary, Eamon began staying with James Gerard Hamilton, aka Hamill, an old friend of his dad's. He was an old fella by now, but because he was an old mate of his dad's, he bonded with him through drink and the regular fight. One morning, Eamonn Magee, Hamill, Connolly, and another man, Martin Clark, were in the house when the RA stormed in, separated them all, and began interrogating each one. In the end, they took Clark and beat the shit out of him until they forced him to confess to a robbery of a Provo house. Terence was informed, who in turn told his son, "They've got you banged to rights, son. You'll need to go with them." Clarky was singing like a canary. You may need to teach him to keep his mouth shut. He wouldn't fucking stop talking. Eamon had two options, either be kneecapped or exiled from Ireland. He chose the latter, but before he and his pals jumped on a plane to England, they stopped by at a hospital to give Clark a further beating for grassing them up. So not only had Clark had a beating off the IRA, Eamonn Magee goes in and gives him a few beatings just for good measure as well for being a grass. Now, Eamon and one of his mates stayed in London for 9 months with Isabel's brother Charlie, who ran a demolition business. His job was to knock down walls and tow the rubble. He began living above a pub and got kicked out of many more for fighting, and not just for being from Northern Ireland. Due to the constant bombings in the early 90s, the Northern Irish were very rarely welcomed with open arms. Eamon hated every minute of his time in London and finally returned home for Christmas in 1994. He put out the feelers for the possibility of a permanent stay, and to his surprise, there appeared to be no major opposition to him moving back into the district.
Well, Sinn Féin were now fully engaged in peace talks with the British government, and in August, the Provos had announced a ceasefire. Eamon was given a pass and went back to live with Mary, but he fell straight back into the same old routine of obviously drinking and drugs. She asked Isabel, Terence, so Isabel is mum, Terence his dad, and his brothers for support to help Eamon before it was too late. And the intervention was a disaster. Eamon went berserk, slammed the door and left. When Noel returned home, he felt a sense of guilt. So he wrote to his youngest brother. He wrote him a letter telling him that he needed to get back to boxing again. Noel himself was pretty much done with boxing after a decade as a professional and ended his letter with a plea. And it said, "Come with me to speak with John Breen and Barney Eastwood before it's too late." He was hoping to read the letter to his brother face to face, but when he arrived from Newcastle at his house in Ireland, he was unconscious, had his face on drink. So he left the letter with Eamon and went home. 3 days later, no answered the phone. It was Eamon. "Let's go and see Breen then," he said. Well, Barney Eastwood actually asked John Breen, probably one of the most successful Irish trainers in history, to find out more about the youngest McGee brother who he was going to sign 5 years ago. And his report back to Eastwood was, "I asked about 40 people about him, Barney. They all said the exact same thing. There is no doubt this guy is one hell of a fighter, but there is even less doubt that he's a complete arsehole." Barney was reluctant, but offered Eamonn Magee a terrible offer of 500 quid for 10 wins. The offer was rejected, and obviously Eamon told him to stick up his ass.
I'd tell him to stick it up his arse as well.
I
500
would.
quid for 10 wins. Even in the 90s, that's still
Bollocks,
extortionate.
isn't it?
It's bollocks, absolute bollocks. And just think of all the stuff that's already gone on before he's looking to turn professional. Well, his brother Noel continued to press John Breen to give him a chance, so he allowed him in the gym to train and work with him on the pads. He was impressed and was beginning to double think his initial thoughts. One night he was having dinner with his father-in-law, Mike Callaghan, a former matchmaker for John Solomon's back in the day. That night John Breen planted a seed in Mike's head. This was the man who had put together the bills for when Randolph Turpin beat the great Sugar Ray Robinson in Earls Court in 1951, and Henry Cooper's first crack at a young Cassius Clay in Wembley Stadium in 1963. In the 60s and 70s, Mike began promoting his own shows in Belfast, introducing a young Barney Eastwood to the sport. But due to the troubles, Mike walked away from the sport, but he had an itch to return, and the man that made him scratch it was none other than Eamonn Magee. He decided to have a sit down with Eamon. No deals or written contracts were discussed. Mike just said he wouldn't take a penny from his purses until he earned over $5,000. They departed with a handshake on the agreement, and they were now partners, fighter and manager. Eamon's trainer would be John Breen, and after proving his attitude was right with 7 months of straight training and 6 days in the gym, he was given his professional boxing licence and debut on a Steve Collins undercard on November the 25th, 1995, at The Point in Dublin. The 24-year-old Eamonn Magee took on Pete Roberts in the super welterweight division and ended his first professional fight with just 5 seconds left on the clock in the 4th and final round. Magee landed a beautiful body shot that left Roberts on the canvas, gasping for air while being counted out.
Great start. And Eamonn Magee fought his first 2 professional fights on Frank Warren cards. He won both, one by stoppage and one by decision. And not only was Mike Callaghan happy with those 2 performances, he could also see the attention he was getting from his ticket sales. So much so that Barry Hearn, who was obviously the other big-time promoter at the time, stood up and took notice. And because he was putting on a show in the Ulster Hall in a couple of months, he requested for Magee to be added to the card, and Callaghan was happy to oblige. Eamon returned to the Ulster Hall for the first time since 1994 in the Ulster final on May 28, 1996. Eamon took on a guy called John Stovin and stole the show. knocking the man from hold down twice in the first before the referee stopped it in the second, to the delight of the Belfast crowd. After the performance, a happy Barry Hearn told the Belfast Telegraph, "He really stood out. I want to do a deal with Mike Callaghan because Eamon can play a key role in the future Ulster Hall shows. At this stage, it is not who you are beating, but the way you do it, and McGee clearly has great potential. The atmosphere when McGee was fighting couldn't be ignored. He sold a lot of tickets, and that's another reason why I want to work with him and Mike." Of course you did. Eamon moved on and stopped Kevin McKillen midway through the fifth. Although Eamon was showing Breen and Callaghan that he was committed to boxing, but he was still pitching himself up at the bars and clubs as soon as he left the gym. He also moved on to another drug during this time, which would become the newest addiction, and that was cocaine, which of course went hand in hand with the booze.
The low-level opponents he was facing just didn't give him any real need to stop the narcotics and drink. He was just too good for those guys, even though he was coked up. However, when he moved up to the next level, all the drink and drugs binges would eventually catch up with him. But for the time being, he was earning decent money and selling tickets with ease. His new substance of choice wasn't the only problem. His street fighting also continued. He knocked out a soldier who gave him verbal, got done for a fray during a brawl at a pub during a Rangers Celtic game where he was caught on CCTV giving someone a kick, and then he knocked out a drug dealer while working on a club door. Now, even though the guy was a known dealer, he still pressed charges against Eamon, which gave him 240 hours of community service, and he had to cough up 12 grand after he pressed further for compensation. The irony of a drug dealer pressing for compensation after getting the shit kicked out of him is quite funny, to be honest. I
think the police had it out for him there, didn't they? Surely.
Well, with a fray and assault on his record, he would be due in court, and a custodian sentence was still a possibility. Even with that hovering over him, Eamon stopped Sean Stokes and came through a horrible fight against journeyman Carl Taylor. Then he got an unexpected call from his pal, Wayne McCulloch, who was based in the US, and his former manager, now moving into promoting, Matt Tinley, wanted Eamon on his show, so he agreed to a one-fight deal against Anthony Townsend in Austin, Texas. He stopped him in the first round, and the American plaudits were immediate, with legendary MC Jimmy Lennon Jr. saying, "Boston, New York, Chicago, the world is his oyster." Dan Goosen said, "This kid is something special. He's got a big future." Promoter Tinley was also full of praise, and he wanted to sign him, and he said, "McGee can be a big attraction in America. I don't hang about with wasters. Eamon Magee will be a world champion, and that's why I want to sign him."
Well, Callaghan was more than happy, but he wasn't going to sign him to a promoter just yet, although Tinley, Warren and Hearn all now wanted to sign him, or wanted to sign him to sign on a dotted line. Now, however, Jamaican-born two-gun Teddy Reid was ready to dampen Eamon's quick rise. The American-based fighter came in 6.5 pounds overweight, and although he shredded some of that weight before the fight, he was still massive in comparison to McGee. It was a close fight though, but Reid got the decision on 2 of the judges' scorecards in Boston, and Eamon lost his first professional fight. Now, even though he had lost, all the promoters still wanted a piece of him because he sold tickets, and he came back with 2 stoppages to finish off 1997. Callaghan decided that the best person to sign with was Frank Maloney, and that's who he signed, who also currently then had the WBC heavyweight champion Lennox Lewis on his books as well. Now, Eamon began 1998 with 2 more wins to go 11-1, then pleaded guilty to the charges of affray and assault, causing both actual and grievous bodily harm, and picked up a £750 fine and 100 hours more community service. His next bout was live on Sky Sports for the vacant Commonwealth Boxing Council Super Lightweight title against Paul Burke at the Bowlers Exhibition Centre in Manchester. Now, for the occasion, Eamon wore his Irish colours to the ring, which caused quite a stir. For some of the Irish, anyway, they felt that he had chosen a side rather than wearing neutral colours, like the likes of Barry McGuigan and Wayne McCulloch had done. Now, the irony of the commotion was, as Eamon put it, "I never wore the Irish colours against Burke in the fight. I was dressed head to toe in fucking Ivory Coast flag. Indeed, if you go back and look at it, he was. They actually got the colours right, but the order wrong. So he actually come in looking like an Ivory Coast flag rather than the Irish one, but they still kicked off about it anyway. Well, the garment was wrong, and so was the decision. And if you haven't seen this fight, you can catch this fight. Burke took the first 4, but McGee won the rest. He even put his man down 4 times in this fight, but the referee refused to count any of them as knockdowns. It's a fight to go back and look at, guys. Trust me.
Well, Burke's hand touched the floor once and his knees 3 times. It was just the referee that scored the bout, and he gave it to Burke, but he was the only one that saw that result. Ian Darke, Glenn McCrory, Barry McGuigan and Chris Eubank all gave Eamon the fight. Eubank summed it up the best. "Someone should be hung, shot and quartered," he began. "I think it is plain for everyone to see, all the viewers at home, to see that was... Listen, everyone has eyes to see, and one makes 2, you know. This didn't add up tonight, and this is not a controversial thing to say." There, of course, was my worst impression of Chris Eubank Sr. Well, Eamon was shocked, but he tried to make fun of it, saying Stevie Wonder must have judged it. It's just as bad as Josh Taylor's win over Jack Catterall recently. Eamon was so pissed with the decision that he hit the beer and the coke hard, knocked someone out for goading him about the defeat, and then headed out to Tenerife on a travel agent scam. Still fuming with the controversial loss, constantly drunk and coked up, he knocked out a mate at the airport and then had a scuff with the Spanish taxi drivers. He was getting the better of a group of them when CS gas was deployed from the police to subdue him. He was then arrested and spent a night in a Spanish cell before they sent him on his way. Eamon needed to get back to training and back in the ring. And that's what he did. The rematch with Burke was on, then off, then the Irish title became available, then that was taken off the table again. Eamon was getting irritated with all of it, but finally got an opponent he could take his frustrations out on. Poor Alan Temple was the unfortunate soul, and he was knocked out brutally in the 3rd round, unconscious, before he even hit the deck. But let's just go back to what happened in the aftermath of that controversial loss to Paul Burke. So, just listing this off now for everybody. So he hits...
Sorry, I don't need to laugh. He's funny. Go on, John. Go on.
So he hits the beer and the coke card. He knocks someone out for goading them because they were goading him about losing to Paul Burke. Then he goes to Tenerife and it's on a travel agent scam. He's still pissed off, so he's still back on the coke and the drink. He then knocks out one of his own mates at the airport, has a scuff with a load of Spanish taxi drivers, gets CS gassed, ends up spending a night in a Spanish cell. Oh my God, like, if anybody needed boxing, it was Eamon Magee. He needed that really focus. Was. My word, what a hell of events that were going on there.
Oh my goodness me. It's endless with Eamon. I mean, he'll admit it himself. I mean, wow. It's just once he lets it, the thing is when he's drunk and he's on the drugs, he's just a nightmare. It's quite simple as that. I mean, you can see it yourself. It's incredible. We're going to carry on with the story now. That was a great impression by Chris Eubank, by the way, Sean. You had me in absolute fits of laughter. So finally, the Paul Burke rematch was made on September the 13th, 1999, and it was billed seeking justice. Eamon was not going to let this fight go to the cards. He told reporters the referee will be redundant this time. I'll walk right through him. Burke knows that I beat him the last time and I will do it again. There's no doubt in my mind that he'll get a hiding. The only way he'll beat me is if I have a heart attack. Well, the fight ended in the 6th round and Eamon got his revenge and he became the Commonwealth Boxing Council super lightweight champion after another savage performance. He admitted in a post-fight press conference, I went in there, wanted to kill him. It's a terrible thing to say that, but that's how I felt. I wanted to tear his head off. I bet he said fucking. I'm sure he would have said fucking in that. Around this time, Maloney tried to convince Callahan that a fight with the 21-year-old Ricky Hatton was the best offer on the table. But Mike and Eamon only had eyes for one opponent at this time, and that was Liverpool's WBU champion of the world, which was Shay Neary. However, Neary lost his title to Irish Mickey Ward, and Eamon then missed out on a fight against Ivan Robinson. That was the guy obviously that fought Gatti a few times. He had 3 keep busy fights, knocking out all 3 of them. When the Neary fight was agreed to take place on a Lennox Lewis undercard, he had to pull out due to nerve damage from his gold tooth. It was apparently all swollen up, and he couldn't train. He was in pain, and the fight with Neary was rescheduled to November. Now, 5 months away from the ring, unable to train, he's in pain, which was not good for someone like Eamonn Magee because he spent the whole time getting pissed, sniffing, and popping pills. The only thing that stopped him from his binge was actually a call to be a last-minute replacement for a fight against Pavel Melnikov, which was only a week away. And Eamon basically laboured to victory in this fight. It looked terrible. It was on Sky Sports, but it was just another reminder that he needed to be in better shape, top shape, if he was going to beat Neary.
The McGee team were so impressed with the Malikov fight that they brought him in as a sparring partner to prepare for Neary. Before the fight, Eamon told the Irish Independent, "I don't want to be a world champion. I want to be a millionaire, but you have to fight for world titles to earn that sort of money. If I won the lotto on Saturday night, you'd never see me in a ring again. It's as simple as that." The fight was broadcast live on Sky Sports box office and took place on November the 11th in the year 2000 at the Waterfront in Belfast. Author Paul Gibson explained the added needle on rivalry when he wrote, "It was awarded the tagline, Men of War, while ostensibly a simple, cliched nod to the two protagonists' highly physical profession. It carried added resonance given Eamon and Shea's youthful past as Vienna petrol bomber and British squaddy on the streets of Northern Ireland. The fight itself was a very close call, more probably edged it to Neary, but the referee Roy Francis scored the fight 116-114 to McGee, and he retained his Commonwealth title. Big names were now being mentioned, from the likes of Zab Judah to Arturo Gatti, but neither materialised. Instead, he fought 3 times in 2001 against modest opposition, defending his Commonwealth title twice. The inactivity and lack of gym visits meant that much of his spare time was taken up with the drink, the cocaine, pills, other women, and now his gambling had increased. He was known to stick 20 grand on a horse, even up to 40, while he was earning decent money from boxing. Eamon told Paul Gibson, "A gambling addiction is a really terrible fucking thing. It can control you every bit as bad as the drink and the gear. It can trick you into thinking that money grows on trees, and so it doesn't matter if you lose, you'll get the money back again soon one way or another." And that's just what I believed back then, that there was always another score, or another win, or another big purse just around the corner.
Well, Eamon would defend his Commonwealth title again, this time against Jonathan Faxton, as the chief support of Hatton Krivo Lapov in February, and pursuing both came through unharmed and victors. The Hitman versus McGee, or known as the Terminator this time, would finally take place in the summer of 2002. Of course, both did win, and it was Eamon who stole the show as well with his 6th round stoppage of Faxton, who had Hatton had a bit of trouble with Faxton as well before this, who argued with the referee as well on the stoppage, but it was probably the right call, as he did look like only a matter of time before McGee would eventually get rid of him anyway. The victory paved the way for the Hatton showdown, but the one man he grew to respect, Mike Callahan, actually suffered a heart attack and was in hospital recovering before the fight. Now, the over 70-year-old needed to slow down, basically. He was still running around like a 30-year-old, and he would have still been, he was still involved with Eamon, but he just needed to just bring it down a little bit, which he did. Now, for all the crazy stories that we have shared with you during this episode, there's going to be a few more. One thing we have failed to mention is the kind of side of Eamon Magee. And he was well known to do good deeds throughout his life and throughout his areas and his district, from running the Belfast Marathon for a hospice, painting an elder's front room for nothing, and helping the community just because he just wanted to with no gain. There was nothing in it for him. He just did it. He even raised money for a family that were trying to get overseas to see their son compete in the Paralympic Games. He didn't just raise the required amount, he raised even more so they could take the whole family, the grandkids as well. Eamon, look, is generally a good person, but the drink and the drugs brought out the worst side of him. But we're going to go back to the boxing after we've given you that nice story, a nice piece on Eamon. This is the dark side of boxing after all. We're back to the boxing, and after 5 defences of his Commonwealth title, he vacated and went in search of the WBU super lightweight title, which was held by Ricky Hatton, who was actually making his 6th defence. Eamon was actually moved to a quieter area north of the border, as Callahan and Breen always used to do this anyway, just to keep him away from the bars and the clubs. But look, Eamon Magee was a high functioning alcoholic and he just couldn't stop himself. And with that, there will be repercussions.
Well, during the 6-week camp, he trained hard when he had to, but when he had free time, he managed to find a pub and have a good drink. It was those drinking habits that forced the most unusual situations, as explained again by author Paul Gibson. One night, the IRA broke into his isolated farmhouse and demanded a talk with Eamon, who had barricaded himself, his brother Patrick and friend Mickey Hughes in the bedroom. After talking through the bedroom door, Eamon finally opened the door, expecting a kicking. "What do yous want?" he asked. "Just a word, like I said. I'm glad we found you here tonight. We've been round before, and there was no sign of you." "I'm normally here." No, you're not. And that's the problem. Normally, you're out in that fucking Jeep, driving around these roads, pissed at all hours, boozing and shagging all around you from what we hear. What are you?" "Shut up, McGee. Just fucking listen for once in your life. You don't come into our area and behave like that, understood?" Eamon nodded. "Also, you're fighting Fricky fucking Hatton in less than a fortnight, and you're drunk every other night. What the fuck are you playing at?" Eamon responds by saying, "What? This is the big one. Concentrate on training for a few fucking weeks, and you could be set for life after it." "Okay, Jesus Christ, message received." "We only want to help you, you know." "Help me? Fuck me, lads. You think kicking my door through and marching in here with guns in your hands is helping me? Could you have not just sent me a fucking text message or something?" "Watch yourself, Eamon. You're the guest down here, and we can very quickly put you out." And they left, and so did Eamon, his brother, and Mickey the next morning. They pitched up somewhere else in Belfast and got to work for the biggest fight of his life. But that is a belting story. The fact that they just turned up like... He's thinking, shit. He must have been thinking at the time, shit, what the fuck have I done now? Like, seriously, what the hell are these guys doing at my door? And actually, the reason he was there was not because he was fucking parading around everywhere doing what he was doing. Actually, they knew he was fighting this fighter in Ricky Hatton, who they obviously identified themselves as someone who was potentially going to the top. And they thought this might be a way of Eamon Magee to take it. Because surely, if he would have got to the top, and he would have maybe beaten Ricky Hatton, would they have then wanted to take control of him in some way, shape or form? That's what it makes me think when you think about this story and this incident that occurred.
It's so true. That's what I think. And I mean, the funniness of the whole thing is he's driving around in a Jeep as well. In that Jeep, there's plastered across it, Eamon Magee versus Ricky Hatton. So it's not like he can get away from it as well. It's a big advertising Jeep. But yeah, I mean, like, it's petrified. I mean, they broke in the house. He's like, shit, someone's breaking in the house. Gets his brothers and his mate in, and then barricades the door and then knocking. I mean, why don't you send a fucking text message? I mean, you got to make him right. Fuck me, lads. You just burst through my door and giving me some advice. Fucking hell, it's crazy. But you're right. I think if he had have gone on to win that fight, I think he was on for like 4 to 5 million as well if he had have won. So I'm guessing they would have definitely tried to put an influence on there. But yeah, great story. And well, not for them. If I remember rightly, I believe his brother told the story and Eamon slightly different, but pretty much the same. And Patrick's is more like, "Oh, fucking shitting me pants," whereas Eamon's just always make a laugh out of it. It's quite funny. But the night arrived on June 1st, 2002 at the MEN Arena in Manchester as Eamon and his team went to make their way to the ring. Pints of beer, piss and abuse showered them. They never intimidated Eamon. Nothing's going to intimidate Eamon. If you've got the IRA kicking your door in and he's still not intimidated, he's definitely not going to be intimidated by some people in the crowd throwing piss over him. It just made him angrier. Now, with just 45 seconds into this fight, when they eventually entered the ring, he dropped Ricky Hatton for the first time in his professional career with a short right hook. In the second, Magee almost did the unbelievable and stopped Hatton when he was buzzed again. If it wasn't for the couple of seconds that referee Mickey Van allowed Hatton to recover, he sort of jumped in and pushed Magee back, which is a weird thing to do. He may well have put him down again. Who knows? We never know. Hatton was actually cut in the fourth, and Magee had taken probably 3 of the first 4 rounds, and the upset looked on. However, Ricky Hatton came on strong, got himself together, and pushed him to the point where he's either level or in front by the 9th round, whatever you want to decide. From then on, the rounds were close and you could have scored it either way. But the home fighter, the face of Sky Sports and British boxing, and the champion who was always going to get the nod in any close rounds, well, he took those rounds. And the result was Ricky Hatton by unanimous decision, with two of the judges handing in cards of 116 to 111, which was a pretty unfair reflection of the fight. I think the third had it a lot more realistic at 115, 112, but you could even push it at 114, 113 for Hatton. Hatton wins the fight, but it's a tight fight. Could easily have been scored closer than it was. In his book, the Hitman Hatton devotes a full chapter to Eamonn Magee. Go and read it. It's a great chapter describing their bout as one of the toughest of his career and the most useful in terms of how much he learned throughout this fight and then going on. Eamon felt that he had won the fight, but knew he wouldn't get the decision. He left the MEN arena straight from the fight. He left it pissed, and he never sobered up for a week as he continued to binge on drugs and drink to master pain of the defeat.
He ended up making friends with Alex Hurricane Higgins, the two-time world snooker champion, after that Hatton loss, and together they struck up a friendship that involved drink and drugs. After returning to the ring in a comfortable victory in his next fight, he was supposed to be fighting for the British title against Junior Witter, but the offer of a fight against the European super lightweight champion Oktay Erkal was a bigger opportunity. So his team took the fight, which was to be staged in Germany. This would be a rematch from their amateur days when Erkal took a decision against Magee in 1993. 10 years later, the result was the same, and Magee was on the wrong end of a unanimous decision loss in what was another close fight. Dejected, Eamon thought of retirement, but then he was offered the chance to fight Jimmy Vincent for the vacant WBU welterweight title in Cardiff, so he happily accepted the challenge in the weight division above. On December the 6th, 2003, Magee was not going to be denied, and he was finally on the right end of a unanimous decision, with two judges scoring the fight 116-112 and the third giving it much wider 119-109. That victory was the first of a 6-fight deal with Frank Warren, and Magee was confident of a big year in 2004. Unfortunately, that big year was ruined because of a neighbour called Joe Clark. Now, it all started with an incident involving Eamon's son Junior, who had a fight with Clark's son. Now, after breaking up the fight, Clark threatened to slap Junior. When Eamon got wind of the threat, he went round to his neighbour's house and knocked him down. Clark was a lotto winner and a connected man with the IRA. Now, nothing came of it until a snowball fight with their children went over the top, resulting in Mary and Joe Clark having a row.
So Eamon was basically not happy. He wasn't having none of it. He spoke to his daughter about this snowball fight. She was sort of saying that it was their fault. So he went out and then obviously having a row with his, his missus. So he goes over to Clark's house and quite simply, he ends up headbutting him. Now, he went home and knowing that obviously Clark's a connected man, and he called his friend Joe to collect him. He could see through his window that Clark was now on the blower to the IRA buddies, and he knew they were on their way. So he needed his mate to arrive before. So as Eamon's friend did finally arrive, so did IRA, and in a car. Obviously, he's jumped in the motor, told him, let's go, let's fucking go. So they've spud off. The next thing, the car's in pursuit of him with Clark in it as well, him and his IRA pals. They got caught in traffic, and then all of a sudden, the car sort of edged in front, and it spins in front, and it gets in front of Eamon's getaway car. They stop now. They're in front of him. So they get out of the motor, and well, the guys, they're tooled up. They've got baseball bats and pickaxes. And Eamon's mate sitting in the driver's seat, and he just freezes. All right, Eamon's saying, reverse, get the fuck out of here. He just freezes, he shits himself. Now, Clark gets to the car, and he begins to pull Eamon out of the passenger side. Now, what happens next, we're going to let the author Paul Gibson explain from his book. And it said, Clark eventually gave up on dragging Magee out of the car and instead set to work on his kicking legs with the heavy wooden club. Now, each swing was that of a baseball slugger aiming for the fences, and each direct hit splattered blood into the road and emitted a sickening crunch of busting muscle and fracturing bone. Eamon, convinced he was fighting for his life, didn't feel a thing. And it was only when he stole a glance back at Clark that he noticed that he could see straight through his flesh to his own splintered tibia. Look what you've done to my leg, you big bastard, he shouted between the blows. Clark must have looked, and the gruesome sight must have interrupted his blind fury, for he immediately seized the attack and walked calmly back to his car. Still, Joe, the driver, just hadn't moved a muscle, but Eamon soon snapped him out of his daze. He said, "Come on, you silly bastard." He managed between gritted teeth, close the door and get me to the fucking hospital.
Oh my God. Oh, honestly, this, if you've listened to this episode at this point, you're thinking, like, we've hardly covered boxing in this episode. A lot of this episode is true dark side of boxing style of just incident after incident after incident, and this is just another incident that's occurred. A neighbourly dispute turned into something more sinister, and again, Eamon Magee ends up this time on the wrong end of a beatdown, and it just amazes me, like, how he got through all these years of these moments like this and still managed to go on. Now, Eamon was rushed to hospital and then into theatre, where surgeons worked on the compound fractures of his tibia and fibula and a shattered knee. There was heavy bruising all over his body, and they also discovered a punctured lung. The next day, he was transferred to the Ulster Hospital in East Belfast, where specialists took muscle from his calf and tissue from his thigh and grafted it over the gaping hole in the front of his leg. After surgery, Eamon asked if he would box again, but the doctor told him that he may never walk again, let alone box again. Eamon was devastated, but he was also worried that Clark would return to finish him off. But Breen knew Clark well and spoke to him, and a truce was made as long as they stay out of each other's way. Eamon returned home, but was suffering with paranoia, thinking someone would arrive and finish him off. Now, if things weren't bad enough, Eamon's mistress, Maria, fell pregnant, and he chose to stick with her and leave Mary behind. He sat her and the kids down and confessed to his year-long affair, and that she was pregnant and that he would be moving in with her. Now, depression hit Eamon more than ever, and it wasn't long before he was back drinking and taking drugs and gambling, and even with that, he began to start taking his first steps and then walking, which led him back to Mary or in some other woman's bed for the night. However, 5 months on from both of his legs being broken, he walked back into the gym and convinced John Breen that he wanted to box again. He worked so hard that by Christmas 2004, Eamon was back sparring and getting ready to defend his WBU title after the British Boxing Board of Control renewed his boxing licence.
Wow. That's what I'm going to say before we move on. Wow. By March 2005, Eamon Magee was back in the ring again. Alan Vesta was the opponent at the King's Hall in Belfast, which would actually be broadcast live on Sky Sports. John Breen gave an interview with the Belfast Telegraph on the eve of the fight, and this is what he said. "I think the whole of Northern Ireland should be behind Eamon when he steps into the ring. We live in a troubled place, and Eamon has done his fair share of troubles, but he's back. I truly believe he's an inspiration to anyone who has been intimidated, anyone who has suffered, because he has come back from the brink. I didn't think he would be back, but he just refused to give up. He refused to let anyone stop him from defending his world title. There's only one Eamon Magee." Jim Watt, who was co-commentating that night, summed up the life of Eamon Magee in one paragraph. He said, "It's unbelievable. If they used Eamon's life for a Hollywood script, they'd have to water it down because it's too unbelievable. In his lifetime, he has been shot, he has been stabbed, he has been crippled, and here he is defending a world championship after 15 months out. The man is truly amazing." The fight was the perfect comeback for Eamon, who won by a 3rd round stoppage. Ian Dark on commentary duty coined Eamon's new nickname. He was not the Terminator, he's the Miracle Man. Eamon pulled out a betting slip from his sock and showed it to the crowd. He had wagered 100 quid on himself to stop Vesta in the 3rd at odds of 12-1. He then spotted Eubank at ringside and gave him a bear hug, and Eubank said afterwards, "I'd never seen him box live before, but when I heard what he had gone through, I had to get on a plane and come to watch. I don't know him as a man, but as a fighter, he has the character and the true grit that seems to be missing quite a bit today. He's a proper fighter.
On the ring apron, Eamon dedicated his win for the doctors and nurses that saved him and then told the cameras, "It's the only thing I know how to do, and I just can't walk away from a game I love so much." Eamon celebrated the only way he knew how, with a lot of drinking and drugs. He even went on holiday to the Costa del Sol, and yet again ended up getting into a fight with another taxi driver for trying to overcharge him before heading home. But drinking and drugs wasn't his only buzz. He also ran another marathon for charity, did a sponsored walk and continued to help those less fortunate. He missed out on the Sports Star of the Year to David Healy, the Northern Irish footballer who scored the winning goal in a 1-0 win against England, but was given a special award for his remarkable comeback and defence of his world title. Maria gave birth to their son, Ethan Peter Marvin McGill. Marvin was after Hagler. He made his second defence of the WBU welterweight title against Takaloo at the King's Hall in Belfast and packed the place out. However, Eamon was now 34 and definitely feeling the effects from his first defence physically and emotionally, so he produced a very below par performance. This was a fight where he looked tired and not the same McGee we had come to see previously. He lost a kind majority decision against a younger and fresher Iran-born fighter. McGee then fought a layup and then moved on to fighting for the British welterweight title against Kevin Anderson in Motherwell on May the 11th, 2007. Eamon was 9 years older, but to his credit he fought a close battle against a fighter he would have beaten in his prime. After being knocked down for the first time in his career in the 11th, he gritted his teeth and battled on to the final bell. And that's where his boxing career essentially ends. We haven't really covered too much of his boxing career for this episode because of all the incidents throughout his life. And of course there are a few more twists in the tail just yet with this story in Eamon Magee's life. But the boxing career itself, I suppose, is a good minute to talk about how maybe some people look at him and say, did he overachieve or did he underachieve? Now you've heard most of this story at this point. To me, my initial reaction now, knowing what I know now, is I feel he underachieved. All that amateur pedigree, everything that he had behind him, the drink, the drugs, the gambling, the women, everything that was going on outside of the ring, the fighting with Spanish taxi drivers all the time and even his old mates. I mean, all these incidents, we laugh about them, but you take them out of the equation, and to me, you've got a guy who is fully focused and dedicated to the sport, who could have potentially moved up to a higher level.
I agree. I actually think he would have been a world champion. I think he was good enough to move through weights and probably win. You've got a lot of titles around. He would have picked up a title. Like he won the WBU title, which was a good. I mean, it was good in terms of what it presented. You had some guys who were genuine fighters that held that title. Okay, it was people sort of hoped it would become a WBO, but I think Sean, that's a great question. I initially thought that he was an overachiever, but now we've got to this point. He was an underachiever, 110%. You look at the people that were around him and what they were seeing in him. I know he was a ticket seller, but this guy had the potential. You got to remember, he's already got shot in his thigh by the IRA. I mean, he's lucky he didn't lose his leg then. He comes through that, he gets glassed in the flipping neck, which apparently you could have fit 4 fingers in, a massive hole in his neck. It's like there was always something that happened. It's just one thing after another that sort of just prolonged his career. It derailed his career. But Sean, I think he absolutely underachieved. He could have been a further world champion, and possibly, I believe, he could have been unified champion. The way people talk about him, he was a superb boxer. So he won
the WBU, and obviously people might say, well, we're discrediting him for saying that he wasn't a world champion. If you're going on that basis, yes, he was technically a world champion, but of an organisation which was very lightly regarded. I suppose around that time, early to mid 2000s, the WBU title was, I'd say it was regarded more so in the UK because it brought a lot of UK based fighters the opportunity to move further on and challenge for one of the bigger known organisation titles like your WBA, WBC, IBFs. WBU was kind of like your sort of stepping stone to the bigger titles. It's kind of like maybe what the IBO is regarded like today. When a fighter wins the IBO title, automatically, it technically puts them as a world champion, but then it leads them on to bigger and better opportunities within the major sanctioning bodies. So no, I'm not discrediting him as a world champion. What I'm saying is, I think he definitely would have competed at world level, and you're saying is that he would have been a world champion maybe within like the IBF, WBO, WBA or WBC.
Exactly that. I believe he could have been. I think he would have given, if he'd have knuckled down and got himself in great shape, because when he was in good shape, he was almost impossible to hit at times, and that's what a lot of people said. And he was a good fighter. I mean, he was. I mean, his boxing career was over after 33 fights. He won 27, knocked out 20 of them, and lost only 6. And you could probably say 2 of those defeats he shouldn't have taken as well. I think 2 or maybe even 3 of those, the guy that was too big, the controversial, that horrible decision that he should have got, and then the one over in Germany. I think you take this, he's only really lost 3, and against good fighters, one when he was a bit older. Although boxing would save Eamonn Magee for the darkest moments in his life, he actually retired from the sport in good spirits and looking forward to his future. But life has a knack for kicking you in the balls, as it always does. And that moment came 2 months later after his retirement, when his dad, Terence, passed away after a battle with cancer. Not long after, Eamon was diagnosed with depression. And this is what he said. He said, it isn't the type of thing that just appears from one day to the next. It's something that creeps up on you gradually. You don't need a doctor to tell you, you sense it in yourself. And anyone who has had the life I've had is going to struggle with things like that. Eamon went on to become a trainer and a cutman, working alongside the man he's always trusted and respected in John Breen, and had successful fighters as well along the way. He is completely aware that he's a high functioning alcoholic and has to have a drink every day to feel normal. He actually gets them delivered. He has to have a drink in the morning. It's just the way it is. He's tried to go to rehab, but it never worked. And he actually told, this is what he said to Paul Gibson. He said, I'm absolutely fine to go to the doctor for a full medical every year. The first time I did, the doc said I'm fit and healthy. I thought the bastard was just telling me what I wanted to hear. I went mad in his surgery. How the fuck can I be healthy? He shouted. I told him I'd been drinking and doing drugs. Did you not fucking check me liver? I asked. He said, it is all in perfect shape. And anyway, he added, what am I supposed to do when I come home from the gym? It's always been the same. I don't read books, and I only put the TV on in the background to fall asleep at night. So what do you want me to do? There's fuck all to do in this country that doesn't involve drink.
Well, in some respects, he's not wrong there. Now, Mary and Maria were both still in his life and actually became friendly with one another through their love for Eamon. Both say they suffered with domestic violence, physical and mental. They both believe that Eamon is bipolar, a dangerous Jekyll and Hyde character. The most lovely, genuine and heartfelt man in the world one day, then a hateful, hurtful bully the next. Eamon sees it differently. For him, they had the ability to control and abuse him. He was just reacting. Eamon spent the entirety of 2010 in court, in prison, or released on bail. He was initially sentenced to 6 months inside for assault, but that was overturned on appeal in March. In April, charges of breaking a non-molestation order against Maria were added, and he returned to his cell in Maghaberry prison. After months on remand, he was released to live in Hull with Vicky, a woman he had met years before while boxing in England, and only permitted to enter Northern Ireland for his own court cases. Eamon was charged with an assault on Maria, which ended with a 12-month sentence, but appealed the ruling and was released back to East Yorkshire. But when Vicky kicked him out over the summer, he was forced to sneak back to Northern Ireland. That unauthorised crossing of the Irish Sea violated the conditions of his bail, and after a couple of months of hiding out, the authorities tracked him down and returned him to Maghaberry for the remainder of 2010. On the other charge, Eamon maintained that his remark to kill Mary was just in the heat of the moment, but he withdrew his appeal against the conviction for threatening to kill her and booting her car as she stormed off. Around the same time, Maria declined to give evidence against him, and that assault conviction was also overturned.
Well, for the first time in 18 months, Eamon left court that February with no charges hanging over him and no more trials in the future. By 2014, he was continuing with his drinking and sniffing and was up in court again for another assault charge against Mary. This time, kicking her and nicking 30 quid out of her purse, which led to a 4-month suspended sentence. Then, after an assault on a man that he said provoked him, he was finally sent to prison for 4 months, but an immediate appeal got him out on bail. Eamon's exploits throughout the year had an effect on his kids, but his boxing clearly rubbed off on his sons. Junior and Francis both took up boxing as kids, but the youngest brother of the two found more of a gift for it, and that was obviously Eamon Jr. Now, after a decent amateur career, Junior wanted to turn professional, and initially Eamon began working with him, but their relationship broke down and he went with someone else. He made his pro debut in 2014 without his dad in sight. They looked to have patched things up and Junior returned, but then I had another falling out with Eamon, which meant Eamon missed his second pro fight, once again, not even in the arena. Now, after a night in the pub, it was Eamon Jr. and I believe Francis as well. I think maybe even one of the brothers, and they were they'd patched up their differences, but Eamon wanted Junior. He wanted to pursue Junior for matchroom. I think he wanted him on Eddie's shows and things like that, with like watching Eubank Junior and stuff. He wanted a bit of that. And Eamon Junior just weren't interested, but they seemed to be on good terms. But unfortunately, this night in the pub, it was the last time that Eamonn Magee would see his son. So 2 months later, on May 2015, Eamonn Magee Jr. was with a girlfriend until the early hours of the morning. Still up and they weren't tired, they decided to order a pizza. Then at 2:40 a.m., Junior opened the back door to see what was taking this bloody pizza so long. He was met by a guy in his late 30s, Orhan Coker, who plunged a 6-inch kitchen blade into his thigh, buttocks, and then chest. Coker then withdrew the knife and stabbed him a further 3 times before running into the night.
Junior tried to rise but merely stumbled forward into the darkness. His blood was found on a child's slide in the backyard, the gate, a parked car, and finally the curbside, where he was found by passers-by. An ambulance was there in minutes, but it was too late. Eamon Sr. was high on cocaine when he finally answered his phone. It was his mother who told him to get to the hospital quick. When he arrived, he was told the devastating news that his son had died. The Turkish national killed Junior because he was jealous of his relationship with his ex-girlfriend Courtney Ward and apparently warned her to end it on social media. Coker initially denied the killing, claiming he had panicked and lunged at what he believed to be a house intruder with garden shears. Following his guilty plea, the trial judge declared that it had been a premeditated and planned murder, which was both brutal and sustained. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison. Now already depressed, Eamon contemplated suicide, so walked into his local health centre and asked to see his GP. The receptionist told him that it would be impossible, that he'd need to make an appointment and come back in a couple of days. Eamon erupted. "I'm telling you, I'm going to fucking kill myself, and you're telling me to go away and come back in a few days." Eamon Magee, he's had a hard life. And by all the stories in this episode, you can either feel sorry for him, or can you consider him a violent thug? And then just when you warm to him, he does something that's so irrational. Is it his character? Is it him? Or was it the drugs and the drink? What was it that caused him to change so erratically? Was it really an undiagnosed condition? There are many things there with this story, Johnston, with Eamon Magee's life, that you could say it's one thing, it's another thing, it's a combination of things, but it's really a hard story when you think about some of the things that he's had to go through. Some of the things you can sit there and go, well, he's brought that upon himself because he was high as a kite and doing things that were irrational. But then you can kind of see behind the mask of the drugs and the drink that there is a guy who genuinely was a guy who was just coming from such a hard upbringing in them early days in the 70s and the 80s of all the stuff that was going on in Northern Ireland, and all the divide and all the killings and the loss of people, and watching his dad getting beaten up and taken away, and all the stuff that you've gone through. It's an adverse childhood experience, and adverse childhood experiences do carry on through into adulthood. So to me, it was the result of those adverse childhood experiences that led on for him making those irrational decisions throughout the course of his life. And that cliche saying we've used before, the product of his own environment. He became a product of that environment, and he carried that through with him. And it's such a shame that, he got to certain points of his boxing career where you kind of feel like there was a moment there where he could have become something bigger than what he was, and then something would just pull him back in, usually the drink and the drugs. And it's just such a hard one. Like, as a human being, do you condone him? Do you not condone him, for doing some of them things? Do you not like him for doing some of them things? Ultimately, as a human being, you're going to say no. You despise someone doing that sort of stuff. But a part of you surely has to feel like sympathy towards some of the moments throughout his life which have then led on to these. People will argue with us and say, well, no, you shouldn't even feel anything towards him because he's done some terrible things. But there are things that people have done that we've covered before that are 10 times worse than some of these things that he's done. And I think, for me, summing it up from my perspective, is that Eamonn Magee was a fighter at heart, a fighter from the beginning, who just couldn't overcome that level of adversity, and still to this day, has the issues that he has to deal with on a daily basis.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, I think for me, he says a product of his own environment. I think that's pretty much what it was. I suppose some people will point to the fact that he had 3 brothers, and his 3 brothers were the complete opposite to him, the polar opposite. They didn't stick around. One moved to Wales, one went to Newcastle, and one went somewhere in England, and somewhere else in England, and that's where they lived. They got out as soon as they could, as soon as they possibly humanly could. They got out, and they live normal lives. They don't live lives like Eamonn Magee. So you've got 4 brothers, and one of them stayed. The irony of the situation is that some people say, well, why didn't he go? He was the youngest. He loved his mum. He didn't want to leave his mum. He had a good relationship with his dad, although his dad was suffering. He watched his dad die and turn into nothing. Like, he just wasted away in the end. And the fact he was a young boy fighting from very young, and he seen his dad hit the bottle, obviously an influence on him, and he starts drinking at, what was it, 9 years old? I just don't think there's much chance for anyone that starts drinking at 9 years old if no one can capture that. And people tried. It was molded that way. He wanted to fight, and there was loads of things going on around him. He was attracted to the trouble, and inevitably he become the trouble. I think that's just what happens with these guys. Unfortunately, there is a liking with Eamonn Magee though. A lot of people say he's genuinely nice. It's just the drugs and the drink that turns him into a monster. So you just stay away from him, I suppose. But it's troubling, isn't it? The crazy thing is, you expect Eamonn Magee to be the one stabbed 6 times and laying on a pavement somewhere, but it's his young boy that didn't hurt fly. I think that's the one thing that I think really. That's worse for Eamon, isn't it? Surely, I think the fact that he has to live, it's nothing to do with him, but the fact that he has to live with himself, trying to live without his son. He's still got a son and a daughter, but I think that's crushed him. I do, and I think he's gone off the rails, mate.
Well, the last article, Johnston, that you've surfaced here, there is a bit of information from earlier on this year published by Belfast Live in February of 2022, and it was with the headline, former boxing champion Eamonn Magee charged with assaulting and imprisoning a woman. And it continued to say, former boxing champion Eamonn Magee has appeared in court charged with assaulting and imprisoning a woman. The 50-year-old was arrested in connection with the alleged offences at an undisclosed location in Belfast on February the 10th. Magee, of Exile Gardens in the city, is accused of common assault and false imprisonment. As the allegations were put to him at a Belfast magistrates' court on Monday, he replied, "It is the most gobbledygook I've ever heard in my life." Defence solicitor Ewan McKenna confirmed he is aware of and is contesting the charges. Mr McKenna stressed the alleged injured party has not made a statement of complaint. Judge Alan White granted bail on condition. McGee lives at an address to be approved by police. As part of the release terms, he is barred from West Belfast, cannot contact any prosecution witnesses, and must not be under the influence of alcohol in public. However, McGee was reassured that he can still drink at home after he asked the judge, "I'm allowed to have a sip in my own house?" And we thought that would be a way to end this story with that last comment from Eamon Magee. Still looking for his next sip of beer, maybe. He was due to appear in court 4 weeks later, but we've not been able to source any more information. That information has been kept quite privately, and if there is something that we have overlooked about that story and is out there and you've listened to it and been able to find it, then obviously let us know, because it'd be interesting to sort of know where sort of things are out there. And of course, Eamon is on Twitter. He's actually on Twitter at Terminator McGee, and it looks like from his Twitter account he has been retweeting a few things. I know he's got a nephew who's recently released an Irish boxing podcast, and you know, he is active on Twitter, seemingly tweeting a few of his old fights, some of the things that we've spoken about in this episode. So it would be interesting to hear from Eamon ourselves, I suppose. Like, you know, we like to do our after shows and our additionals, and you know, maybe at this point, if Eamon, you're listening to this episode and it's somehow reached you, please reach out to us, because we would absolutely love to have you on and have a chat with you and bring you on to the conversation about where things are at for you now. I suppose that's the one thing with this episode, is that it essentially is not an open and shut case like some of our stories that we cover, but it certainly has got to a point in Eamon's life where it feels a little bit like, from that news article earlier this year, that maybe just he's still plagued a little bit by those troubles, Johnston.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, the fact that there's both articles, I think it was like two or three of them, sort of saying 4 weeks later, we're going to, you know, it's going to come back and you're going to hear it. And you haven't heard anything. This was February 2022, by the way. So it does make you think that it probably was, as he said, a load of old gobbledygook and someone's just making up a stupid story. I think the fact is that, you know, with Eamon Magee, from like Paul Gibson's book, you know, we encourage you, go and read that book. That, you know, Eamon was a big part of that. He spoke to his brothers, his mother, you know, pretty much anyone that was alive in and around Eamon Magee. So there's some even more stories about Eamon, and he told him not to hold back. I mean, the one thing that's plagued him is the death of his son. Is, you know, I think he ended the book asking Paul Magee to finish it on him putting the plaque. I think it was a year on from his son dying at the same spot where he died on the pavement. He's got a plaque there. At the same time, he delivers it at like 2:30 in the morning or whatever. You know, Mary's plagued with it. I mean, everyone all says, though, his mum, Isabel, and Mary, they both say they actually worry for him. What do you say to someone that's lost their son? It's so in such tragic circumstances, especially someone that suffers with depression. I mean, look, all you can say is that, you know, there is you just don't do nothing stupid kind of thing, but life does go on. And he's sort of associated with the people that are in the same sort of society as him. So he will, you know, the high functioning alcoholic, he's still there. I think boxing is a major thing for McGee, isn't it, Sean? I think that's the one thing that always pulled him back and saved him. His women didn't do it. Nothing else really did it. It was the boxing. Boxing was his pullback, and you know, his brothers knew it. That's why his brother said, "Look, you've got to get back into boxing." There's people around boxing, and thankfully, he was associated with good people within that. Sometimes we get these fighters that are associated. We had it recently, you know, where just get money diggers and people that just want you for your money. So he was fortunate in that respect, but he was very unfortunate in what he was brought up in, and some of them horroring stories from the trouble, Sean. I mean, wow. That is a real eye opener for anyone that didn't know about those days, and considering they weren't long ago. You know, we're talking the 80s and 90s, people. He was literally, Eamon Magee was brought up in a war-torn country, pretty much. Just it was a very small area, and as he said, you know, it felt like that was the whole world. That was the whole world to these kids. So, you know, you're brought up in that trouble, seeing people just getting shot in front of you and murdered, people getting murdered, knowing people that have done the murdering and have been murdered. It's hard to get rid of that. You know, it really is. And the stuff that he suffered and went through, we laughed about some of the stories because they are comical. They are. We're not disrespecting Eamon Magee or his family, but I mean, it's truly epitomizes why we do these episodes, Ocean, doesn't it? Eamon Magee fits the bill quite perfectly, doesn't he?
Well, yeah, because I said at the start of the show, this is a story about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And
It
throughout the
is.
course of this episode, we've covered the good, the bad, and the ugly, and there's been a moment for each category there of Eamon Magee's life and his story continues, and, you know, he's still active, like I said, he's on Twitter at Terminator McGee, and if it reaches him, and he's listened to this episode, and, you know, he wants to get involved more, and he wants to do something, or somebody knows him who can send it to him, if he wants to get involved and wants to jump on an episode and wants to do an aftermath or an additional episode to this, then we're more than willing to get on, because who better to hear it from than the man himself? There's a lot of source material out there. Of course, Paul Gibson's book was a huge influence on us being able to put this episode together, plus our own research that we've done separately aside from that book. It'd be good to hear from him directly and know that he's okay, because part of me feels like, you know, who's looking out for him? Is there anyone looking out for him? Is there any support? I'm sure there is, but then you know how boxers can fall on such difficult times. We've seen it. How many times have we seen these stories of boxers going in such hard times when there's no focus, there's nothing to pull them back in to keep them on the straight and narrow? I just hope that, you know, there is something in his life at the moment that's got him back on that straight and narrow, and that, you know, he's able to continue on in life at a steady pace. And all those crazy moments that we've covered throughout this episode are, you know, kind of behind him a little bit now. But for me, it's been a real eye-opening episode. What I knew about him before was absolutely nothing on what I've learned about him doing this episode on Eamon Magee, and I hope that everybody listening has enjoyed the episode. And if you have, please do let us know on Twitter at darker_side_pod, and you can find us everywhere else at the BTR Boxing Podcast Network. You can subscribe to us on any available podcasting app. The most common are Apple, Google, or even Spotify, but we are on any available podcasting app out there. You can find the episodes on the YouTube channel as well if you want to consume it that way. If you want to go on TikTok, we've even got a TikTok account. You can find us on there at BTR Boxing Podcast and listen to the short audiograms that we post up on there as well. And I've got to finally say thank you to the patrons of this podcast, because without their support, we won't have been able to delve more into the archives and pay for access to get more research for episodes like this and for the whole season, and to be able to outsource promotional videos and, you know, all the different things that we do to make the series even greater than what it's been before. Without you guys supporting us that way, we wouldn't have been able to get it to an even greater height. So I just want to say a big thank you to everybody for doing that. But if you're not a patron of the podcast and you are interested in knowing more about it, you can find that out by checking us out on patreon.com/BTR Boxing Podcast. On there we have early access to episodes such as this series-based content. You can get early access to episodes like this and from our other shows like Legendary Nights and Career Profiles. Every show is ad-free as well if you want to subscribe to us and do that. But more importantly, we provide content on there that we don't provide to the general public. So if you want additional content, all different types of categories and series that we've started running on there, then you can do so by becoming a patron. That is it for this episode number 2 of season 3 of The Darker Side of Boxing, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the extraordinary life of Eamon Magee.